If you think about what fraud is the creation of trust, and then it's betrayal. Keating was a not very effective real estate developer who was brought in to acquire Lincoln Savings and Loan by Michael Milken. Charles Keating was and is a very nasty, fraudulent guy. His reputation was, quote, for buying and selling politicians, unquote. One of the people on this list was then Representative McCain. They were confidants, they were mutual political supporters. Of course, the money flowed one direction from Charles Keating to then Representative and eventually Senator McCain.
Over 3 campaigns, including his 1986 Senate campaign, John McCain received roughly $112,000 from Mr. Keating, ACC employees, and their families.
He was someone that McCain took much of his policy advice from on how you should regulate, or in this case, not regulate, savings and loans. The unique aspect of this relationship between Senator McCain and Charles Keating extended to the family. They're personal friends. Keating flies him down multiple times to the Bahamas at Keating's expense. Keating doesn't simply fly Senator McCain, he flies Senator McCain's wife as well, and the kids, and this one I really like, the babysitter, so that you can make it a real vacation. Regulators had discovered that Keating had engaged in a massive violation of a key rule called the direct investment rule. And this rule restricted how much savings and loans could own in the way of real estate as opposed to making loans on it. The key to this rule was that direct investments were an ideal way to engage in accounting fraud. And accounting fraud is the weapon of choice of these kinds of corporate frauds. Keating had violated the direct investment rule by over $615 million, the largest violation in the history of the agency. And savings and loans that did significant amounts of direct investment always failed, and failed catastrophically.
I'm identifying for you what this case is that we are talking about. 1, several senators met with regulators about a pending enforcement matter involving a single company which had sued the bank board in the federal courts.
Keating has set up the meeting by recruiting 5 U.S. senators, and of course all 5 of the senators received major political contributions from Charles Keating. The purpose of the meeting from Keating's standpoint is very clear because he puts it in writing. He wants us not to take any enforcement action against this violation of the direct investment rule. Effectively, he wants to immunize the worst violation in our history in an institution he's looting. 2,
the senators did not have aides present, and more importantly, the chief regulator, Chairman Gray, was specifically directed not to bring aides with him.
This meeting was set up for deniability, and the idea was to have 5 U.S. senators there and only 1 regulator there. So there'd be the word of 5 U.S. senators against the 1 regulator with no aides to back him up.
3, Mr. Keating, on whose behalf the meeting was held, was a major political contributor to each of the senators who attended the meeting.
And that leads to the meeting precisely 1 week later with 4 of us from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and all 5 U.S. senators. It was perceived as enormous pressure and designed to intimidate because that's exactly how Charles Keating set it up.
4, the regulators were asked to withdraw a duly promulgated regulation at the request of a single company and were told that the company would do certain things in return.
We are analogous to the police. Can you imagine someone coming to the police and saying, well, you caught these guys red-handed, and they've committed this enormous crime, the biggest in your history, and you know that this kind of crime always leads to terrible, terrible harm to the public, but we don't want you to do anything because he's a big political contributor to us, so you shouldn't take any action. So we didn't think that they would have the nerve to try to do it again when there were actually witnesses. And in particular, we didn't think they would have the nerve because one of my jobs at the meeting was to take notes. And they do this same thing at the start of the meeting. Senator DeConcini says, we want you not to take enforcement action against the institution. And Senator DeConcini does it speaking on behalf of the group that he's hosting. And Senator McCain says nothing to distinguish himself or to say, no, that's not proper. Skip forward in time. After more direct political pressure set up by the Keating Five, the bank board stops all action to even find the facts against Lincoln Savings, even though it knows it's a criminal enterprise. Keating is allowed to stay open for an additional 2 years, which allows them to cause these massive losses of $3.4 billion. It produced the most expensive failure in U.S. history of a depository institution. Senator McCain knew the facts because we had briefed him. He knew this was a criminal enterprise. He knew that what was being done was improper. He knew how much undue political pressure, his words, or at least his words originally, was being brought to bear. He was uniquely in the position where he could have protested this and stopped it, stopped this loss, but he did nothing. And his statement is, once I figured out that Keating was not being abused, I no longer had any need to protect my constituent. But all the taxpayers of America were his constituents. We all ended up paying that $3.4 billion. He just never got it. Lots of people had drunk the Kool-Aid about deregulation in that era. Now, the savings and loan debacle taught a whole lot of people that was an error, but it didn't teach that to Senator McCain. Instead, he instinctively goes towards greater deregulation.
While I was traveling overseas, our financial markets experienced unfortunately, another round of upheaval.
His reaction to the subprime crisis that we're going through now, which is unquestionably a product of deregulation, was to recommend in his first speech that we should have further deregulation.
Our financial market approach should include encouraging increased capital in financial institutions by removing regulatory, accounting, and tax impediments to raising capital.
If you look at why Lehman and Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch and AIG and Fannie and Freddie are all in crisis, is because all of them played games on the accounting because you set up perverse systems that allow people to lie. And that comes back to why you need regulators. Senator McCain has not learned the lessons and has continued to follow policies that are going to produce a disaster. You create that kind of environment, you'll get the same thing that you had in the savings and loan crisis, except that now we are so globalized that the bubbles will be much bigger and you will cause a financial crisis not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world.